I'm going to tell you a story that will make you question everything you think you know about enemies, survival, and the lines we draw in the sand. It's about a young woman named Margaret, trapped by a killer winter, her world shrunk to 4 wooden walls and the sound of her own hungry stomach. One night, a knock comes at her door. Standing outside is the one person she's been taught her entire life to fear more than death itself. She's faced with a choice that will either save her life or end it. But what happens after she opens that door is a story so full of twists, so packed with unbelievable courage, it will restore your faith in the power of a human heart to see past the hatred. The wind of December 1875 didn't just howl, it screamed. It was a living, breathing monster clawing at the walls of Margaret O'Brien's tiny cabin, trying to find a way in. It rattled the windows and seeped through the cracks in the wood, carrying the frozen breath of the Arizona mountains with it. Inside, Margaret pulled a threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders. The fire in the hearth was a weak, sputtering thing, a pale imitation of warmth. It cast long, dancing shadows that made the one-room cabin feel both like a prison and a tomb. She was 22 years old, with hair like spun gold and eyes the color of a spring meadow. But the wild beauty of the frontier had been chipped away by hardship, leaving behind a creature of sharp angles and haunted eyes. The girl she once was had been buried 3 months ago, right alongside her father. Consumption, the doctor in town had called it. Margaret called it a thief. It had stolen her father's breath, then it had stolen her future, leaving her utterly alone on a homestead 20 miles from the nearest sign of life. The winter had come down from the mountains like a wolf, early and savage. Her supplies, meant to last until spring, were a distant memory. The last of the salted meat was gone weeks ago. The vegetables from her garden were frozen ghosts under a thick blanket of white. For dinner, she was stirring a pot of thin, watery soup. It was the 3rd night in a row. A few wild herbs she'd dug up during a brief break in the storm gave it a bitter taste, but it was hot. That was all that mattered. Her stomach twisted into a tight, angry knot of hunger, but she forced herself to eat slowly, trying to fool her body into thinking it was a real meal. Outside, the storm found a new voice, a deep, guttural roar. A shutter slammed against the wall with the force of a hammer blow, and the candle on her small table danced wildly, threatening to plunge her into darkness. Margaret got up and crept to the window, her bare feet cold against the rough wooden floor. She peered through a tiny crack in the shutters. The world outside was gone, replaced by a churning, endless ocean of white. Snowdrifts were already climbing the walls of the cabin, sealing her in. If this kept up, she wouldn't be snowed in. She'd be buried alive. And that's when she heard it. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a branch cracking under the weight of the snow. It was footsteps, heavy, deliberate, crunching through the deep powder. Someone was walking toward her door. Margaret's heart stopped, then hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. No one should be out here. No one could be out here. Not in this blizzard. Not this far from town. Her eyes shot to the fireplace. Her father's old rifle hung on 2 wooden pegs above the mantel. Her hand moved toward it without a thought, her fingers remembering the cold, heavy feel of the steel. The footsteps stopped, right outside her door. The silence that followed was worse than the storm. It was a heavy, listening silence. An eternity passed in a single heartbeat. Then came the knock. 3 solid, powerful knocks that shook the very foundation of the cabin. They didn't sound like a lost traveler. They sounded like fate. "Who's there?" Margaret called out, her voice a reedy whisper she barely recognized. She snatched the rifle from the wall, her hands clumsy but sure. She checked the load, just as her father had taught her. She'd only ever used it to hunt rabbits. She prayed she wouldn't have to use it for anything else. A voice answered from the other side of the door, deep and resonant, cutting through the howl of the wind. "I mean you no harm." The accent was strange. It wasn't the slow drawl of the local settlers. It wasn't the clipped tone of the cavalrymen. It was something else entirely, something older. I seek shelter from the storm. Every instinct screamed at her. Don't open the door. You're alone. You're helpless. But another voice, a quieter one, whispered of Christian charity, of the sin of leaving a man to die in the freezing cold. State your name and business, she demanded, moving closer to the door, the barrel of the rifle pointed straight at the wood. There was a pause. Then the voice replied, and the words turned the blood in her veins to ice. I am called Ayans, of the Western Apache. Apache. The word echoed in the small cabin, filled with the ghosts of 1,000 campfire stories. Stories of raids, of burned homesteads, of settlers dragged away into the mountains, never to be seen again. The newspapers were filled with them. He was the monster in the dark, the savage her father had warned her about. But he hadn't broken down the door. He could have. The flimsy wooden bar was no match for a determined man. Instead, he was standing out there in a lethal storm, politely asking to be let in. It didn't make sense. I'm alone here, she said, and she didn't know why she was telling him the truth. Maybe she wanted him to know how little she had to offer, or how vulnerable she was. I ask only for shelter, the voice replied, calm and steady. I have my own provisions. I will share them. Let me in. Your nights shall no longer be cold. There was something in that last sentence. It wasn't just a promise of warmth from the storm. It was something more, something that resonated deep in the lonely, frightened corners of her soul. Against all reason, against every warning bell clanging in her head, her hand moved toward the wooden bar securing the door. Her heart was a drum against her ribs. He must be able to hear it. Taking a shaky breath that felt like her last, she lifted the bar and pulled the door open. The man standing on her doorstep wasn't a man. He was a force of nature. He stood well over 6 feet tall, his shoulders so broad they filled the entire doorframe, blocking out the swirling snow behind him. His skin was the color of rich, burnished copper, pulled taut over high cheekbones and a strong jaw. He wasn't the grotesque caricature from the newspapers. His face held a kind of stark, classical beauty, like a statue carved from the very mountains he called home. But it was his eyes that held her. They were dark brown, deep and intelligent, and they held a wisdom that seemed ancient, and something else, a profound sadness. Snow clung to his long black hair, and the buckskin jacket stretched across his powerful chest. He was shivering, a slight, almost imperceptible tremor that betrayed the stoic mask on his face. Whatever he was, whatever danger he represented, he was also just a man freezing to death. Come in, she heard herself say, the words a stranger to her own ears. He ducked his head to clear the low frame and stepped inside. He brought the scent of pine and cold air and wildness with him. The cabin, already small, seemed to shrink around him. He moved with a quiet, deliberate grace, careful not to startle her further. I thank you, he said, his dark eyes sweeping the room, taking in the meager furnishings, the sputtering fire, the nearly empty pot of soup. You show great courage, opening your door to a stranger. Or great foolishness, Margaret shot back, though she found herself lowering the rifle. He slid a heavy leather pack from his shoulders and set it gently on the floor. You chose mercy over fear. That speaks well of your character. He knelt and unfastened the pack. Margaret's eyes widened. He pulled out a parcel of dried meat, a pouch of cornmeal, and several smaller leather bags that smelled of spices and herbs. Her stomach let out a loud, pathetic growl. A hot blush crept up her neck. His gaze flicked to her face, his expression unreadable. When did you last eat a full meal? He asked, his voice soft without judgment. I eat every day, she said, the lie thin and brittle. He didn't challenge her. He simply stood, took the pot of her pathetic soup, and began adding chunks of his dried meat to it. He moved around her small kitchen space with an easy familiarity, mixing his cornmeal with a little water from her bucket, shaping it into small, flat cakes, which he placed on a hot stone near the fire. You live here alone, he stated. It wasn't a question. My father died 3 months ago. The words came out before she could stop them. The winter has been harsh for everyone, he said, his back to her as he tended the food. Even my people have struggled to find game. The smell filling the cabin was intoxicating, rich, savory, real, the aroma of life. Margaret felt a wave of dizziness as the scent hit her empty stomach. This man, this dangerous Apache warrior, was in her home, cooking for her, sharing his precious supplies without a second thought. It went against everything she had ever been taught. Why? She asked suddenly, the word bursting out of her. Why are you helping me? He paused, his hand hovering over the pot. He turned to look at her, his dark eyes searching hers. Does kindness require a reason? From an Apache to a white settler? She countered, her voice shaking slightly. Yes, I'd say it does. His face grew serious, the lines around his eyes deepening. There has been too much blood between our peoples, too much fear, too much hate. But you opened your door to me. You saw a man freezing in a storm, not just an Apache. Perhaps it is time for different choices. He served her a bowl of the now thick, hearty stew, along with one of the warm corn cakes. Her hands trembled as she took it. Pride warred with ravenous hunger. Hunger won. She ate like a starved animal, the hot food a miracle in her mouth. She didn't care how it looked. This is delicious, she managed to say between mouthfuls. Thank you. Food shared tastes better than food eaten alone, he replied simply. He settled himself on the floor by the fire, cross-legged, with his own bowl, eating with a quiet dignity that shamed her. He was no savage. His manners were more refined than many of the men she'd known back in Boston. Where did you learn English so well? She asked, her curiosity overriding her fear. Mission school, he said, not looking up from his food. When I was a boy, the priests sought to civilize us. They taught me your language, your customs, your God. And did they succeed? Did they civilize you? A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. That depends on your definition of civilization. They taught me to read and write, but they could not teach me to forget who I am. The storm still raged, but for the first time in weeks, the cabin was warm. Truly warm. With a full belly and a fire burning brightly with the extra wood Ayans had carried in his pack, a strange sense of peace settled over Margaret. It was a dangerous peace, a foolish peace, but it was there, nonetheless. You can stay, she said, the offer surprising even herself, until the storm passes. I am grateful, he replied, and his eyes met hers across the flickering firelight. There was an intensity in his gaze that made her breath catch. Then his expression shifted, became guarded. But I must warn you. Margaret tensed. Warn me? I was not traveling alone when the storm hit, he said, his voice low and serious. My companions will come looking for me when the weather clears. A new kind of cold, one that had nothing to do with the winter, seeped into the room. Companions? She whispered. How many? He held her gaze, and the peace she had felt shattered into a million pieces. 3, he said, and they may not understand your hospitality as I do. The warmth in the cabin vanished. One Apache was a terrifying risk. 4 of them? That was a death sentence. She'd just invited the wolf into her home, only to learn he'd brought his pack with him. She looked at Ayans, at the man who had shown her such kindness, and searched his face for a hint of a trap, a sign of deception. She found none. only a grave seriousness. "Will I be safe?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. His dark eyes held hers, steady and unwavering. "I give you my word. No harm will come to you while you are under my protection." For some insane reason, she believed him. As the fire crackled and the blizzard roared its fury, Margaret O'Brien, alone and defenseless, put her trust in the word of an Apache warrior. But she couldn't shake the feeling that the storm outside was nothing compared to the one that was about to break inside her tiny cabin. Dawn came as a whisper, a soft gray light filtering through the cracks in the shutters, painting the snow-covered world in shades of pearl and silver. The storm had passed, leaving behind a profound, crystalline silence. Margaret stirred from her makeshift bed by the fire, a strange feeling of warmth and security clinging to her. For a moment, she'd forgotten. Then she saw him. Ayans was sitting by the window, a silent, unmoving silhouette against the morning light. He had kept watch all night. She had felt his presence even in her sleep, a guardian in the shadows. It was a deeply unsettling feeling, to be protected by a man her people considered the enemy. "The storm has passed," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet cabin. "My companions will come soon." Margaret pushed herself up, her joints stiff. She went to the window and peered out. The world was transformed, buried under a thick, pristine blanket of snow. It was beautiful, but it was the beauty of a predator, cold and unforgiving. The anxiety that had receded during the night came flooding back, cold and sharp. "Tell me about them," she said, her voice tight. "Your companions." Ayans was quiet for a long moment, as if weighing each word. "Nish is my younger brother. He has seen 22 winters, but his heart burns with the fire of 1,000. He has watched our people die at the hands of your soldiers. He trusts no one with white skin." Margaret's stomach clenched. "And the others?" "Kitchi is older, a war chief, before the reservations. He is wise, but his wisdom was carved from loss and betrayal. He has learned to survive, but he has not learned to forgive. Then there is Yanaba." Ayans paused, and a shadow passed over his face. "He lost his wife, his children, to cavalry guns 2 seasons ago. He does not speak much anymore. His silence is heavier than any words. An angry young warrior, a betrayed war chief, and a man hollowed out by grief. 3 men with every reason to hate her, to see her as nothing more than a symbol of their suffering. They were coming here, to her home. The brief illusion of safety she had felt was gone. "I should leave," she said, her mind racing. "I can make it to town. If I leave now, before they get here—" "No!" Ayan's voice was firm, cutting through her panic. "The snow is too deep. The wolves are hunting in packs, driven mad by hunger. You would not survive an hour." "Then what am I supposed to do?" she cried, desperation clawing at her throat. He turned from the window to face her, and his eyes were serious, compelling. "Trust," he said simply. "Trust that my word means something to them. Trust that this time can be different." Before she could answer, a sound pierced the silence from outside. A low whistle, sharp and clear, like a bird call, but no bird made a sound like that. Ayans moved to the door, his body a fluid coil of tension. His hand rested on the hilt of the knife at his belt. "They are here." He looked back at her, his gaze locking with hers. "Stay behind me. But do not hide. Do not show them your fear. They will respect courage, even if they distrust your skin." Another whistle, closer this time. Then the crunch of snowshoes. Margaret's heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, but she forced herself to stand tall, to breathe, to pull on a mask of calm she did not feel. Ayans opened the door a crack and stepped partway out, calling out in the rapid, guttural clicks and flowing vowels of the Apache language. A voice answered, sharp and questioning. Another, older voice, joined in, calm and measured. The conversation was tense, an invisible battle being waged just beyond her threshold. Finally, Ayan stepped back, holding the door open, and they came inside. If Ayan's had seemed large in her small cabin, these three men were an occupying army. They filled the space with a raw, untamed energy that sucked the air from her lungs. The one she knew must be Nish, the brother, was lean and wiry, moving with the restless, predatory grace of a cornered cat. His eyes, black as obsidian, swept the room with contempt before landing on her, hot with undisguised hatred. The older one, Kitchi, was broader, his face a roadmap of hard years and harder battles. His gray-streaked hair was braided with feathers and what looked like tiny, polished bones. He studied her not with hate, but with a cold, calculating curiosity, as if she were a strange, new kind of trap. But it was the third man, Yanaba, who stole her breath. His face was a mask of such profound, bottomless grief that it was a physical force in the room. His eyes were dead, two empty pits of loss and rage. When his gaze fell upon her, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. She was looking at a man who had already lost everything, and a man with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous man in the world. "This is Margaret," Ayan said, speaking English for her benefit. "She gave me shelter from the storm." Nish spat a sharp reply in Apache, his eyes never leaving her face. Ayan's answered him calmly, but with a hard edge to his voice that made the younger man fall silent, though his hostile glare remained. "My brother asks why a white woman would help an Apache," Ayan's translated, his voice tight. "He thinks it is a trap." Margaret found her voice, though it was thin and shaky. "There was no trap. I couldn't leave any man to freeze. I don't care who he is." Kitchi, the old chief, stepped forward. He looked her up and down, his gaze lingering on the rifle that was once again propped near the fireplace. "You speak truth," he said, his English heavily accented but surprisingly clear. "But truth is rare in this land." Then Yanaba, the silent one, began to move. He drifted through the cabin like a ghost, his dead eyes examining everything. He touched the spine of one of her father's books. He looked at the small, framed photograph of her parents on the mantelpiece. His gaze was unnerving, as if he could see the history of every object, the story of her entire life. He stopped in front of her. He was so close, she could smell the scent of wood smoke and leather and old sorrow clinging to him. "You are alone," he said, his voice a rough, rasping sound from disuse. It wasn't a question. "My father died," she whispered. Something flickered in the depths of his dead eyes. Not pity, not sympathy, recognition. He nodded once, a sharp, bird-like gesture, and turned away. The tension in the cabin was a thick, suffocating blanket. It felt like a spark could ignite the whole room into violence. These men were not guests. They were judges, and she was on trial. Then Nish spoke again, this time in broken English, his voice dripping with scorn. He pointed at her door. "Cabin is weak, easy to break." "But I did not break it," Ayan said quietly from behind him. "I asked, and she opened." This seemed to give the young warrior pause. He looked from his brother to Margaret to the door, a flicker of confusion crossing his angry face. "White women are weak," he snarled, as if trying to convince himself. A spark of defiance flared in Margaret's chest, burning through her fear. "I am not weak," she said, her voice clear and strong, surprising them all. "I have survived here alone for 3 months. I survived the storm. I survived the hunger. Don't you dare call me weak." A stunned silence fell over the room. Nish stared at her, his jaw tight. Kitchi's eyebrows rose in surprise. Even Yanaba turned his head slightly to look at her. Ayan's translated her words, and Kitchi let out a low chuckle. A genuine smile creased his weathered face, transforming him. "She has spirit," the old warrior said, a new respect in his voice. "Good. Weakness is a death sentence in this land." The air in the cabin shifted. The immediate threat of violence seemed to recede, replaced by a cautious, wary curiosity. They were still dangerous. She was still their prisoner in all but name. But something had changed. She had shown them she was not just a frightened white woman. She was a survivor, just like them. "What happens now?" she asked, looking directly at Ians. "We must wait for the trails to clear," he said. "Another day, maybe 2. Her heart sank. 2 more days trapped in this cabin with these men, walking a tightrope of fear and forced hospitality. She looked at her dwindling supplies. "I don't have enough food," she said bluntly. Nish, who had been staring at her with a new, grudging expression, spoke up. "We hunt," he said, not to his brother, but directly to her. He pointed out the window, saw deer tracks in the snow, fresh. "The young men will hunt," Kitchi declared with a nod. "The old men and the women will tend the fire. It is the way." Margaret felt a flash of irritation at being lumped in with the old men, but she held her tongue. A fragile truce had been declared, and she would do nothing to break it. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, a strange and surreal routine began to form. Ayans and Nish, armed with bows and knives, disappeared into the silent white forest. Kitchi, the old war chief, stayed with her. And Yanaba, the grieving ghost, took up a position by the window, his gaze fixed on the horizon, a silent, solitary watchman. To her astonishment, Margaret found herself working alongside Kitchi in her own kitchen, preparing what little food they had left. He moved with a practiced, efficient grace, showing her how to grind corn finer than she thought possible, how to use pine needles to make a vitamin-rich tea. They spoke in a mixture of his broken English and her simple gestures. "My mother taught me to cook," she found herself telling him as she stirred a pot. She said a woman who couldn't feed her family was no woman at all. Kitchi nodded thoughtfully. "Apache women cook," he said. "They also fight. They build the homes. They are the heart of the people. You fight?" Margaret thought of the past 3 months, the lonely days, the freezing nights, the gnawing hunger, the crushing despair, the constant battle against giving up. "In my own way," she said softly. "I suppose I do." "Good," he said, and there was a deep, rumbling approval in his voice. "The battle is not always with arrows and guns. Sometimes the battle is to simply see the next sunrise." Late in the afternoon, the hunters returned. They were dragging the carcass of a young buck behind them. Margaret watched, mesmerized, as they butchered the animal with a skill and reverence that was both brutal and beautiful. They wasted nothing. Every piece of the animal had a purpose. "You watch," Nish observed, glancing up at her, his hands covered in blood. "Like you have never seen this." "I've cleaned rabbits," she admitted. "Nothing this big." "Is an important skill," Yanaba said from the window, his first words in hours. "A survival skill." That evening, they feasted. They cooked the fresh venison over the fire, the smell of roasting meat filling the cabin, a primal scent of life and plenty. The conversation was halting, broken, but it was there. Ayans told stories of his people, translating when necessary. Kitchi shared wisdom about the mountains and the seasons. Even Nish seemed to thaw, showing her how to properly sharpen her father's old hunting knife until it had an edge like a razor. Yanaba remained silent, but when Margaret offered him the last of her father's coffee, a precious luxury she had been hoarding, he took the cup from her, and his eyes met hers for a fleeting second. In that brief moment, she saw not a monster, but a man drowning in a pain so deep she could barely comprehend it. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was more powerful than any thank you. Later, as they banked the fire for the night, Margaret looked at the 4 men who had invaded her home. They were not the monsters from the stories. They were just men, angry, wise, broken, and proud. The lines between captive and host, between enemy and something else, had begun to blur. The trails should be clear by morning, Ion said, his voice quiet in the dim light. Margaret nodded, a strange pang of sorrow in her chest. The loneliness she had lived with for months was waiting for her just outside the door. After they left, it would rush back in, colder and more suffocating than ever before. "What will you do?" Kitchi asked, his shrewd eyes studying her face. "When we are gone? The winter is not over." It was the question she had been trying so hard not to ask herself. The food from the deer would last a while, but not forever. She was still trapped, still alone. The brief respite they had provided had only highlighted how close to the edge she truly was. "I don't know," she admitted, the words tasting like ash. "I can't get to town, and I can't survive here much longer on my own." The four men exchanged a long, silent look. An entire conversation passed between them in that single glance. Finally, Ayans turned to her, his expression serious, his voice low. "There may be another way," he said carefully, "but it would require a great trust from you, and a courage you may not know you possess." Margaret looked at the faces around the fire, the angry boy, the wise old man, the broken warrior, the leader who had shown her kindness. They were her enemies, they were her saviors, they were the only other living souls she had spoken to in months. Conventional wisdom had brought her to the brink of starvation and despair. Perhaps it was time for something unconventional. "Tell me," she said. Just as the words left her mouth, a new sound came from outside. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't an animal. It was the sharp, unmistakable crack of a branch breaking under a heavy weight. In an instant, the four men transformed. The quiet camaraderie vanished, replaced by a lethal, predatory alertness. They moved with a silent, fluid speed that was terrifying to watch. Ayans was at the window, peering through a crack. Nish was at the back of the cabin, knife in hand. Kitchi and Yanaba flattened themselves into the shadows, melting into the darkness until they were nearly invisible. "Horses," Ayans whispered, his voice a blade of ice. 3, maybe 4, moving slow. Margaret's blood ran cold. Riders moving carefully toward her isolated cabin in the dead of winter could only mean one thing: a patrol. "They look for us," Nish hissed from the darkness. "Or maybe," Kitchi's voice rumbled from a corner, "they check on the lone white woman. A bad storm worries people in town." Margaret crept to the window beside Ian's. Through the sparse trees she could see them, dark figures on horseback, their breath pluming in the frigid air. And as they drew closer, the moonlight glinted off the barrels of their rifles and the brass buttons on their long blue coats. Cavalry. 4 of them, she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. She recognized the man in the lead, a stout, hard-faced man with a thick mustache. "It's Sergeant Morrison, from town." The Apaches exchanged a flurry of urgent, whispered words in their own language. The air crackled with the debate: fight or flee. "No," Margaret said, her voice cutting through their whispers with a firmness that surprised even her. "No violence, not in my home. I will not have blood spilled here." Ayans looked at her, his eyes blazing in the dim light. "They will not offer us the same courtesy. They will take us prisoner, or kill us where we stand." "Not if they don't find you," she said, a desperate plan forming in her mind. "Hide, all of you. Now, I'll handle this." "Woman, you do not understand the danger." Kitchi started to protest. "I understand perfectly," she snapped, her fear transmuting into a strange, cold resolve. "This is my home, my rules. Hide." For a heartbeat they stared at her, 4 deadly warriors being given orders by a lone, unarmed woman. Then, Ayans gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod, and like smoke, they vanished. They melted into the darkest corners, behind the sparse furniture, under her cot, blending with the shadows so completely it was as if they had never been there at all. Just as the last one disappeared from sight, a heavy, official knock pounded on her door. "Miss O'Brien! Sergeant Morrison, Territorial Cavalry. Open up. We need a word with you." Margaret took a single, deep breath, smoothed her dress, and plastered a look of weary surprise on her face. She walked to the door, her legs shaking but her resolve like iron. She lifted the bar and opened the door to the real monsters. Sergeant Morrison stood on her doorstep, his face ruddy from the cold, his eyes small and suspicious. Behind him, 3 young troopers sat on their horses, their hands resting on their rifles, their faces grim. They weren't a rescue party. They were a posse. "Sergeant," Margaret said, forcing a note of relief into her voice. "Thank heavens. I was afraid I'd be trapped here till the spring thaw." "Just checking on you, miss," Morrison said, but his eyes weren't looking at her. They were scanning the cabin behind her, taking in every detail. "That was a nasty storm. Folks in town were worried." "It was kind of them to think of me," she said, blocking the doorway with her body. "But as you can see, I'm perfectly fine. Just a bit low on firewood." Morrison's gaze was sharp, probing. It lingered on the remains of their venison feast, on the single cup that still held the dregs of Yanaba's coffee. He sniffed the air. "Smells like you've been eating well for someone snowed in." "I was lucky," Margaret said quickly. "I managed to trap a deer just before the storm hit. It wandered right up to the cabin." The lie felt clumsy on her tongue. The sergeant swung down from his horse, his boots crunching in the snow. He was a big man, thick and powerful. "Mind if we come in and warm ourselves for a minute? It's been a long ride." It wasn't a request. Margaret's heart hammered. The 4 Apaches were hidden within feet of where he would be standing. The slightest sound, the smallest mistake, would turn her cabin into a slaughterhouse, but refusing him would be even more suspicious. "Of course," she said, stepping aside, her mind racing. "Please come in." Morrison and his troopers stomped into the cabin, bringing the cold and the smell of wet wool with them. They filled the space, their presence loud and intrusive after the quiet dignity of the Apaches. They crowded around the fire, rubbing their hands together, their eyes darting around the room, missing nothing. "You've had visitors," Morrison stated, his gaze fixed on the floor. Margaret followed his eyes. Her blood turned to ice. There, partially kicked under her cot, was a single moccasin. A dark, beaded moccasin, half hidden in the shadows. It was so obvious, she couldn't believe she hadn't seen it. "No," she said, her voice strained. "No one." Morrison bent down slowly and picked it up. He held it in his thick palm, a smug, triumphant smile spreading across his face. "Funny. This don't look like your dancing shoe, Miss O'Brien." He straightened up, his eyes hard as flint. "We've been tracking 4 Apache bucks. Renegades who jumped the reservation. Their trail led right into this valley before the storm hit. And now I find this, in the home of a lone woman who just happens to have a fresh-killed deer and enough food cooked for 5 people." He took a step closer to her, his voice dropping to a low, threatening growl. "I'm gonna ask you one more time. Where are they?" Margaret's mind was a whirlwind of terror. She could feel the presence of the hidden warriors, could feel their coiled tension, their readiness to explode into violence. She had to do something. She had to buy them time. She looked Morrison straight in the eye, a desperate bluff forming on her lips. "They were here," she said, her voice shaking but clear. Morrison's eyes widened in surprise. "They came last night, seeking shelter from the storm," she continued, the story tumbling out of her. "They were hungry. I fed them. They were cold. I let them warm themselves by my fire." "And where are they now?" he demanded, his hand moving to the pistol at his hip. "They left," she lied, praying he would believe her. "Just before dawn. They took some of the meat as thanks, and headed west into the high mountains." Morrison stared at her, his suspicious eyes trying to read her face, to find the lie. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought he bought it. His shoulders relaxed slightly. Then, one of the young troopers by the window spoke, his voice tense. "Sarge, look." He pointed outside. In the fresh, unmarked snow, leading away from the back of the cabin and into the trees, were 4 distinct sets of tracks, made by moccasins. But that was impossible. The Apaches were still in the cabin. Morrison's head snapped toward the window. He saw the tracks. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face as he turned back to her. "Left before dawn, did they? Funny. Looks like they forgot how to cover their trail." He drew his pistol, the click of the hammer being cocked echoing like a gunshot in the silent cabin. "Looks like your friends are still close by. Let's go flush 'em out, boys." He gestured to his men. "Search the cabin, every inch of it." Margaret watched in horror as the troopers began to tear her home apart. They overturned her cot, threw her father's books to the floor, kicked over the small table. They were getting closer and closer to the shadows where the warriors were hiding. Then she understood. The tracks weren't a mistake. They were a message. Ayans, or one of the others, must have slipped out the back window while Morrison was distracted at the front door, made the tracks, and slipped back in. It was a diversion, a brilliant, desperate gambit to draw the soldiers outside, into the open, where the Apaches would have the advantage. But Morrison wasn't taking the bait. He was going to find them here. Now. One of the troopers reached for the pile of furs and blankets in the darkest corner of the room, the spot where she knew Yanaba was hiding. This was it. The bluff had failed. The slaughter was about to begin. Suddenly, Kitchi's voice erupted from the shadows, speaking in rapid Apache. It was a war cry, and all hell broke loose. The cabin exploded into a whirlwind of brutal, chaotic violence. Yanaba rose from the furs like a vengeful spirit, a knife appearing in his hand as if from thin air. The trooper who had been about to uncover him screamed, a short, choked sound, as Yanaba's blade found his throat. Nish launched himself from behind the woodpile, a feral blur of motion, tackling another soldier and bearing him to the ground. Kitchi emerged from the shadows near the hearth, swinging a heavy piece of firewood like a club, catching the third trooper squarely in the side of the head with a sickening crunch. It was over in seconds, 3 soldiers down, their lives extinguished in a flash of savage, desperate efficiency. Only Morrison was left. He stood frozen for a split second, his face a mask of shock and fury, his pistol still in his hand. He raised it, not at the warriors, but at Margaret. "You treacherous—" He began to snarl. He never finished the sentence. Ayans moved out of the darkness behind him, silent as a panther. He didn't use a weapon. He simply slammed the side of his hand into the back of Morrison's neck. The sergeant's eyes rolled back in his head, and he crumpled to the floor like a puppet with its strings cut. Silence descended on the cabin, thick and heavy, broken only by the ragged sound of breathing and the drip, drip, drip of blood onto the wooden floor. Margaret stared at the carnage, at the bodies of the 3 troopers lying in pools of their own blood. She should have been horrified. She should have been screaming. But all she felt was a strange, terrifying calm. She had chosen a side, and this was the consequence. Ayans knelt beside Morrison, checking to make sure he was unconscious, not dead. Kitchi was already dragging the bodies of the dead soldiers toward the door. Nish stood over one of the men, his chest heaving, his eyes wild. Then Yanaba did something that chilled Margaret to the bone. He knelt beside the unconscious Sergeant Morrison. He pulled a small, intricately carved piece of wood from a pouch at his belt. It was a child's toy, a tiny wooden horse. He pressed the toy into Morrison's limp hand, closing the man's fingers around it. Then he leaned in close and whispered something in the sergeant's ear, his voice a low, venomous hiss of pure, undiluted hatred. "What was that?" Margaret asked, her voice trembling. "What did you say to him?" Ayans looked up from securing Morrison's hands. His face was grim. He was reminding him. Reminding him of what? It was Yanaba who answered. his voice rough and full of gravel and broken glass. He turned his dead eyes to her, and for the first time she saw a flicker of the raging inferno behind them. "This man," Yanaba rasped, pointing a bloody finger at the unconscious sergeant. "He is the one who led the raid on my village, the one who gave the order to shoot the women, the children." He held up the small wooden horse. "This belonged to my son." The full, horrifying truth of the situation crashed down on Margaret. This wasn't a random patrol. This wasn't just about renegade Apaches. This was personal. This was a blood feud, and she was standing right in the middle of it. But the horror was just beginning, because that's when Nish, who had been searching the dead soldiers, let out a sharp cry. He held up a folded piece of paper he'd pulled from one of the troopers' pockets. It was a wanted poster, and the face on it wasn't Ian's or Kitchi or any of the others. It was a sketch of a man with a beard and kind eyes, a man she knew better than anyone in the world. It was her father. Margaret snatched the poster from Nish's hand, her own trembling so badly she could barely read the words. Wanted for treason, conspiracy, and aiding hostile Apache forces. Underneath the sketch of her father was another name, a witness who had signed the affidavit, swearing he had seen her father providing guns and supplies to the Apache. The witness was Sergeant Morrison. "This is a lie," she whispered, the paper rattling in her hand. "My father, he was a good man. He was a farmer. Her voice trailed off. She looked around the cabin, at her father's books, his papers, his neatly organized rock collections. He wasn't a farmer. He was a scholar. A man who had been fascinated by this land and its people. A man who had been trying to learn the Apache language. Kitchi came and stood beside her, looking down at the poster. "He was a good man," the old warrior agreed, his voice soft. "A brave man. He tried to help us. He tried to warn us that the soldiers were coming for our sacred lands. He tried to broker a peace." "Sacred lands?" Margaret asked, confused. "This land," Ian said, gesturing to the world outside her window. "Your father discovered what the cavalry has been searching for. There is a silver vein in these mountains, a rich one. It runs directly beneath the place where our ancestors are buried. Morrison and his superiors want it. They want to tear our history from the ground." "My father found the silver?" she breathed, her mind reeling. "But he never said anything." "He knew it would bring destruction," Kitchi said grimly. "He was trying to protect it. For us. He drew a map showing the location of the vein and the location of our burial sites. He was going to take it to the territorial governor to plead our case, to prove the land was ours by treaty and by spirit." "Where is this map?" Margaret asked, a dawning horror on her face. Ayan's dark eyes met hers. "We believe he hid it. Somewhere here, in this cabin. That is why we were coming here, Margaret. We were not just seeking shelter from the storm. We were coming to find your father, to retrieve the map." Her father hadn't died of consumption. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Morrison had found out about the map. He had come here. He had murdered her father to get it, and when he couldn't find it, he had branded him a traitor to cover his tracks. And now, he was back to finish the job. "We have to find it," she said, her voice filled with a new, steely resolve. "We have to find that map and clear my father's name." They began to search, a frantic, desperate race against time. They knew Morrison's patrol would be missed, reinforcements would be sent. They had hours, at most. They tore the cabin apart, looking for a hidden compartment, a loose floorboard, anything. It was Margaret who found it. Tucked away inside the spine of her father's favorite book, a worn copy of Shakespeare's tragedies, was a thin, folded piece of oilskin. It was the map. It was beautifully drawn, her father's precise, scholarly hand detailing every rock, every tree, every stream. And on it, 2 lines were drawn. One, in black ink, marked the path of the silver vein. The other, in red ink, marked the boundaries of the Apache sacred ground. The two lines overlapped almost perfectly. The map was the proof. It was the truth. But then Margaret saw something else, something that made her blood run even colder. At the bottom of the map, her father had written a short note. "If you are reading this, I am dead. Do not trust the governor. He is in league with Morrison. The map must be taken to Fort Grant, to Colonel Whitman. He is the only honest man I have met in this territory. He is our only hope. I have also hidden my journals. They contain everything. The truth is under the heart of the home." Under the heart of the home. Margaret's eyes flew to the stone hearth. It was the center of the cabin, the source of its warmth, its life, its heart. Working together, they pried at the heavy stones at the base of the fireplace. One of them came loose. And underneath, in a small stone-lined cavity, was a leather-bound journal. Her father's journal. Margaret opened it, her hands trembling. The first page was a letter addressed to her. "My dearest Margaret," it began, "if you are reading this, it means I have failed. I am so sorry for the secrets I have kept. I did it only to protect you. The man who will have killed me is Sergeant Morrison. He is a greedy, cruel man who wants to desecrate the Apache lands for the silver they contain. He tried to force me to give him the map. I refused. He will be back. You cannot stay here. You are not safe." The letter went on, detailing everything. His friendship with Kitchi, his respect for the Apache people, his discovery of the silver, and Morrison's plot. And then came the final, devastating lines. "The Apache have promised to look after you. Their leader, Aons, is the son of a great chief I once knew. He is an honorable man. Trust him. Go with them. It is your only chance. Your life as Margaret O'Brien is over. Your new life awaits you. Be strong, my daughter. Be brave. Finish what I started." Tears streamed down Margaret's face as she read her father's last words. He hadn't abandoned her. He had been trying to save her, even from beyond the grave. A sharp whistle from outside shattered the moment. Nish, who had been keeping watch, slipped back into the cabin. "More riders," he hissed. "A lot of them. They're moving fast. Reinforcements. They were out of time." "We have to go," Ion said, his voice urgent. "Now." He looked at the unconscious Morrison, then at the bodies of the dead troopers. "We can't leave them here. They'll know you were involved." "Burn it," Yanaba said, his voice a low growl. "Burn it all. Let the fire cleanse this place." It was a brutal, terrible necessity. They dragged the bodies back inside. They gathered what little food and supplies they could carry. Ayans looked at Margaret, his eyes full of a question he didn't need to ask. Her choice had already been made. Her father had made it for her. Her old life was a pile of ash and lies. Her new life, her real life, was standing in front of her, offering her a future she could never have imagined. "I'm coming with you," she said, her voice clear and steady. She tucked the map and her father's journal safely inside her coat. It was all she had left of him. It was all that mattered now. They worked quickly, piling flammable materials in the center of the room. Kitchi used a burning brand from the fire to set it alight. The flames caught quickly, greedily, licking up the dry wooden walls. They slipped out the back and melted into the snow-covered forest, just as the first of the cavalry reinforcements crested the ridge. From the cover of the trees, Margaret looked back one last time. Her home, her prison, the last remnant of her old life, was being consumed by a roaring funeral pyre. The flames clawed at the winter sky, a beacon of defiance. She didn't feel sadness. She didn't feel fear. She felt a strange, fierce sense of freedom. She turned her back on the fire and followed Ions and his companions deeper into the white, silent wilderness. She was no longer Margaret O'Brien, the lonely settler's daughter. She didn't know who she was yet, but she knew one thing for certain. She was finally going home. The wilderness that swallowed them was a different world. It was silent, vast, and utterly indifferent to their survival. Every step was a struggle against the deep, clinging snow. The cold was a physical enemy, a beast with icy teeth that gnawed at any exposed skin. For Margaret, who had spent the last 3 months within the 4 walls of her cabin, it was a brutal awakening. The pace Ion set was relentless. They were running now, not just from the cavalry, but from the sun itself. They needed to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the burning cabin before a full-scale search began. The unconscious Sergeant Morrison was a dead weight, slung over Kitchy's powerful shoulders, his head lolling with every step. He was too valuable to kill and too dangerous to leave behind. He was their prisoner, their proof, and their curse. Margaret's city-bred muscles screamed in protest. Her lungs burned with every ragged gasp of frigid air. More than once she stumbled and fell, the snow shocking her system like a cold bath. And every time, before she could even register her failure, a strong hand was there to pull her back to her feet. Usually, it was Ion's. His grip was firm, impersonal, but it was a lifeline. Nish, the angry younger brother, seemed to take a grim satisfaction in her struggle. He would glance back at her, his dark eyes filled with a look that said, "I knew you were weak." But he never said the words aloud. Something held him back. Yanaba, the silent ghost, moved with an eerie, weightless grace, scouting ahead, then melting back into their path to report with a series of quiet hand signals that Ion seemed to instantly understand. As the day wore on, a new routine settled in. They moved through the thickest parts of the forest, avoiding open spaces, their path a winding, unpredictable series of switchbacks designed to confuse anyone who might follow. Kitchy, the old chief, seemed to possess a sixth sense for the land. He guided them along frozen creek beds and through dense thickets of pine that offered the best cover. He was the navigator, the living map of this harsh, unforgiving land. That night, they made a cold camp. No fire. The risk of the smoke being seen was too great. They huddled together for warmth in a shallow cave Kitchy found, carved out of a rock face by ancient winds. They ate frozen strips of venison and hard corn cakes, the food tasteless and difficult to chew. Margaret shivered uncontrollably, the cold seeping deep into her bones. She thought she might freeze to death right there. Then a heavy fur blanket was draped over her shoulders. She looked up to see Ions settling beside her, his body a solid wall of warmth against the biting wind. He didn't say a word, but the message was clear. We survived together. She lay awake for a long time, listening to the sounds of the sleeping men around her, the whisper of the wind in the pines, and the distant, lonely howl of a wolf. She was terrified. But for the first time in a very long time, she was not alone. The next day was worse. The terrain grew steeper, more treacherous. They were climbing now, heading for the high passes that would lead them to the hidden canyon Ions had spoken of. Morrison had woken up. He was sullen and defiant, his eyes burning with a venomous hatred, especially for Margaret. "You're a dead woman, O'Brien," he rasped, his throat sore. "When they find me, I'll see you hang, you and these red-skinned devils." Nish's hand flashed to his knife, but Aons stopped him with a sharp command in Apache. "He is worth more to us alive," Ions said in English, for Morrison's benefit. "He is the witness to his own crimes." "No one will believe a word you say," Morrison sneered. "I'm a respected officer, you're savages, and she," he spat, looking at Margaret, "is a traitor to her own kind." The words were meant to wound her, to isolate her. But looking at the faces of the 4 men who were risking everything to protect her, she felt a surprising surge of belonging. "My kind," she said, her voice steady, "are people who value truth and honor. That's something you know nothing about." The look of pure fury on Morrison's face was almost worth the danger they were in. They were crossing a narrow, icy ledge late that afternoon when it happened. The rock beneath Margaret's foot, slick with hidden ice, gave way. She cried out as she lost her footing, her body sliding toward the edge of a sheer drop that fell hundreds of feet to the jagged rocks below. Instinctively, she grabbed for anything, her gloved fingers scrabbling uselessly at the frozen stone. This is it, she thought, a strange sense of calm washing over her. This is how it ends. Then, a hand shot out and clamped around her wrist like a band of steel. It was Nish. He had thrown himself flat on the ledge, his other hand gripping a sturdy root, his body straining to hold her weight. His face was inches from hers, contorted with effort. The hatred was gone from his eyes. In its place was a fierce, desperate concentration. He was not just saving a white woman. He was saving a member of his party. Ayans and Kitchi scrambled back, grabbing her other arm, and together they hauled her back onto the solid ground of the ledge. She lay there, shaking and gasping for breath, the adrenaline roaring in her ears. Nish stood over her, breathing heavily. He didn't smile. He didn't offer a word of comfort. He simply looked down at her and gave a short, curt nod. Then he turned and continued on the trail. But the nod was enough. It was an acknowledgement, an acceptance. She had faced death, and she hadn't panicked. She had fought. In his world, that earned respect. The incident seemed to change the dynamic of the group. The invisible wall between Margaret and the others crumbled a little more. Kitchi began to actively teach her, pointing out edible plants even in the dead of winter, showing her how to read the signs of the weather in the clouds. Yanaba, in a shocking display of communication, actually carved her a small, functional whistle from a piece of wood, showing her the bird calls they used to signal each other. The bond with Ayans deepened, though it remained unspoken. They would often walk together, a comfortable silence stretching between them. She learned to read his moods in the set of his shoulders, in the way he watched the horizon. He was carrying the weight of their survival on his shoulders, and she found herself wanting to help him bear it. One evening, as they sat in the relative comfort of a deeper cave, a small fire shielded by a clever rock formation, she finally pulled out her father's journal. She needed to understand more. "Tell me about my father," she said to Kitchi. "The journal. It says so much, but I want to hear it from you." The old warrior stared into the flames, his face etched with memory. "Your father was a strange man," he began. "He came to us not with a gun, but with questions. He wanted to learn. He respected our ways. He did not see us as savages. He saw us as people. He called himself a friend," Ayans added, his voice low. "It is a word we do not use lightly, but he earned it. When he discovered Morrison's plan for the silver, he came to us. He risked everything to warn us." "And you were coming to get the map from him when the storm hit?" she asked. Ayans nodded. "And to bring him with us, to our hidden valley. For his own safety, we were too late." The grief and regret in his voice were palpable. He hadn't just lost an ally, he had lost a friend. Margaret read aloud from the journal, her father's words filling the small cave. He wrote about Apache customs, their legends, their deep spiritual connection to the land. He described Kitchi's wisdom, Nish's fiery spirit, Yanaba's profound love for his lost family. And he wrote about Ayans. "Ayans is a new kind of leader," she read, her voice soft. "He carries the traditions of his people in his heart, but he understands that the world is changing. He knows they cannot fight the white man's armies forever. He believes that knowledge, reading, writing, understanding the laws of our world, is the new weapon they must learn to wield if they are to survive. He is their future." A deep silence fell over the group as she finished. She looked up and saw that all 4 men were looking at her, their expressions a mixture of sorrow and a fierce, burning pride. She was no longer just the daughter of their fallen friend. She was his legacy, the keeper of his words. Their journey continued. For 3 more days, they pushed through the unforgiving mountains. They narrowly avoided a cavalry patrol, hiding in a crevice as the soldiers passed so close Margaret could hear the jingle of their harnesses. They survived a sudden, violent rock slide that almost buried them alive. Through it all, Margaret grew stronger, more resilient. The harshness of the wilderness was stripping away the soft, civilized woman she had been, revealing a core of steel she never knew she possessed. She was learning to move silently, to endure the cold, to read the land. She was becoming one of them. Finally, late one afternoon, they reached a high, windswept ridge. Below them, nestled between towering cliffs of red rock, was a narrow, hidden canyon. A thin ribbon of green, a line of trees fed by a hidden stream, snaked along the canyon floor. It was invisible from any other vantage point. It was a secret world. "We are here," Ion said, a profound sense of relief in his voice. "This is our home." As they began their descent into the canyon, Margaret felt a sense of trepidation mixed with hope. She was leaving one world completely behind and stepping into another. Her father had wanted this for her. He had believed her future was here. But as they reached the canyon floor, they were not greeted by welcoming arms. Figures emerged from the caves and crude shelters that dotted the canyon walls. Women, children, and old men. Their faces were not friendly. They were hard, suspicious, and full of a deep, abiding sorrow. And their eyes, when they fell on Margaret, were filled with a cold, undisguised hatred that made Nish's earlier hostility feel like a mild dislike. She had survived the wilderness. She had survived the cavalry. But she had a horrifying feeling that the greatest danger she had yet to face was the people she was supposed to call her own. The welcome they received was not one of celebration, but of tense, whispered questions. The eyes of the canyon's inhabitants, no more than 30 souls in total, were on Margaret. They saw her blonde hair, her pale skin, and they saw an enemy. An old woman with a face like cracked leather spat on the ground as she passed. A young boy, no older than 7, threw a rock that glanced off her shoulder. Ayans roared a command in Apache and the boy scurried away, but the message was clear. She was not welcome here. They took Morrison to a small, dry cave, securing him more permanently. Then Ayans led Margaret, Kitchi, Nish, and Yanaba to a larger central cave, where the elders of the small band were waiting. The air was thick with tension. An old man, even more weathered than Kitchi, his face a mask of stern disapproval, was clearly the one in charge. He listened as Ayans spoke, recounting the story of the storm, the cabin, the soldiers, and the map. When he finished, the old man, whose name was Garut, fixed his piercing gaze on Margaret. He spoke in Apache, his voice a harsh growl. Kitchi translated for her. "He asks why you have brought this white woman here. He says she is a bad omen, a poison. She is the daughter of our friend, the one who died trying to protect us," Ayans argued, his voice ringing with authority. "She carries his legacy. She carries the proof that will save our land." "She carries the face of our enemy," Garut shot back. "For every one of her kind that shows us kindness, 1,000 come with rifles and broken treaties. She cannot be trusted." The debate raged on. Margaret stood there feeling like an animal being judged at a market. She felt a surge of anger. She had not asked for this. She had been thrust into it. But she would not be a silent victim. "Tell him," she said to Kitchi, her voice clear and strong, "that I did not choose my skin any more than he did. Tell him that my father died for his people. Tell him that I have risked my life to bring this map and this journal here. Judge me by my actions, not by the color of my hair." Kitchi translated her words, and a murmur went through the assembled elders. Her defiance seemed to impress some, but Garut's expression only hardened. "Actions can be deceiving," the old man said. "She will live, for now, but she is not one of us. She will be a captive, a servant. Nothing more. She will prove her loyalty, or she will die. The decree was absolute. Ayans and Kitchi argued, but the Council of Elders sided with Garut. The old ways were strong here, and the old hatreds ran deep. Margaret was given a small cold alcove at the back of a communal cave to sleep in. She was put to work doing the most menial, grueling tasks, grinding corn for hours until her hands were raw, hauling heavy buckets of water from the stream, cleaning skins with a dull, clumsy scraper. The other women ignored her or spoke to her only to give sharp, barked orders. The only ones who showed her any kindness were Ayans and his companions. They would secretly share extra food with her, and Kitchi would continue to teach her about the land in quiet, stolen moments. But they could not openly defy the elders. The days turned into a week, then 2. Margaret's life became a miserable routine of hard labor and social isolation. The hope that had carried her through the mountains began to wither and die. Her father's words about a new life seemed like a cruel joke. This wasn't a life. It was a prison, no different from the one she had lived in back at the cabin, only colder and more crowded. One afternoon, as she was gathering firewood at the edge of the canyon, a group of the older boys surrounded her. They had been tormenting her for weeks, tripping her, stealing her rations. Today, their taunts escalated. They began to push her, shoving her back and forth between them, their faces twisted with cruel laughter. "White-eye snake," one of them hissed. "Go back to your own kind." He shoved her hard and she stumbled, falling to her knees. A hot, blinding rage born of weeks of humiliation and despair erupted inside her. She was done being a victim. As the boy loomed over her, ready to kick her, she grabbed a thick piece of firewood from the ground. With a scream of pure fury, she scrambled to her feet and swung it with all her might, catching him squarely on the side of his leg. He howled in pain and surprise and stumbled back. The other boys stood frozen in shock. They had expected her to cry. They had not expected her to fight back. She stood there, panting, the heavy branch held like a weapon, her eyes blazing with a fire they had never seen before. "Leave me alone!" she growled, her voice low and dangerous. Suddenly, a voice cut through the tension. "That is enough." Nish was there. He had appeared as if from nowhere. He stood between Margaret and the boys, his arms crossed over his chest, his face a thundercloud. He spoke to the boys in a low, menacing tone, and they scattered like frightened quail. He turned to Margaret. He looked at the branch in her hand, at the defiant fury in her eyes. He didn't scold her, he didn't praise her. He simply gave her that same curt nod he had given her on the icy ledge. "They will not bother you again," he said, and then he was gone. The incident marked another turning point. The physical torment stopped. The women still treated her with cold disdain, but there was a new, grudging respect in their eyes. They had seen that the white woman had a warrior's spirit, but her status as an outcast remained. She was still alone, trapped between two worlds, belonging to neither. The bigger problem was what to do next. The map and the journal were useless if they stayed hidden in the canyon. Their plan had always been to take them to Colonel Whitman at Fort Grant, a journey of over 100 miles through hostile territory. The elders, led by Garut, refused. "It is a fool's errand," the old man declared. "To trust another white man? To risk our best warriors on a journey that will surely lead to their deaths? No. We will stay here. We will hide. It is the only way," Ayans argued passionately. "Hiding is a slow death. The world is closing in. We cannot hide forever. This is our one chance to secure our land, to find justice for our people, to live in peace." The band was divided. The younger warriors, inspired by Ayans, wanted to go. The older generation, scarred by a lifetime of betrayal, sided with Garut. The canyon, once a sanctuary, was now a powder keg of dissent, ready to explode. Margaret watched it all, her heart heavy with despair. Her father's plan, Their only hope was falling apart because of fear and old hatreds. She had to do something. That night, she went to the cave where Morrison was being held. He was guarded by 2 of Jarut's men. She brought him a bowl of water. He sneered at her. "Come to gloat, have you? Your savage friends are going to leave you to rot here. I heard them arguing. You chose the wrong side." "There are no sides," she said quietly. "Only people." She sat with him, talking to him not as a captor, but as a person. She told him about her father, about his love for learning, his respect for the Apache. She didn't try to change his mind. She just talked. And as she spoke, an idea, a wild and incredibly dangerous idea, began to form in her mind. It was a gamble that could get them all killed, but it was also the only path she could see. The next day, she went before the Council of Elders. Ayans and his companions stood with her, confused by her request for a meeting. "I have a proposal," she said, Kitchi translating for her. She looked Garut straight in the eye. "You do not trust the word of Colonel Whitman. You do not trust the white man's justice. So, we will not take the map to him." A murmur of surprise went through the cave. Ayans looked at her, shocked. "Instead," she continued, her voice ringing with a conviction she didn't feel, "we will take our prisoner, Sergeant Morrison. We will take him to Fort Grant, and we will trade him." Garut's eyes narrowed. "Trade him for what? Empty promises?" "No," Margaret said, her heart pounding. "We will trade him for a formal council, a meeting between you, the elders of this band, and Colonel Whitman, on neutral ground. You will bring the map and the journal. You will present your own case. You will look this Colonel Whitman in the eye and see for yourself if he is an honorable man. You will not trust my word for it. You will trust your own eyes." The audacity of the proposal left the council speechless. "It is a trap!" Garut finally roared. "They will slaughter us all!" "They want Morrison back alive," Margaret countered. "He is a cavalry sergeant. They will not risk his life. We will have the advantage. We set the terms." "And who will go on this mission?" Garut demanded. "Who will be the messenger to arrange this trade?" Margaret took a deep breath. This was the most dangerous part of her plan. "I will," she said. "I will go to Fort Grant. Alone. If you're on the edge of your seat, wondering if Margaret can pull off this impossible plan, do us a huge favor and hit that subscribe button. We pour our hearts into bringing you stories like this, tales of incredible courage and unexpected heroes. By subscribing, you become part of our storytelling family, and you ensure we can keep these amazing narratives coming. Now, let's get back to the story and find out if Margaret's desperate gamble will save her new people or lead them all into a trap. The silence in the cave was absolute. Garut stared at her as if she had grown a second head. Ayans took a step forward, his face a mask of disbelief and alarm. "Margaret, no. It is suicide." "It's the only way," she insisted, turning to him, her eyes pleading with him to understand. "They will shoot any of you on sight. But me? I am a white woman. I can walk onto that fort. They will listen to me. Or they will arrest you as a traitor and hang you." Garut sneered. "It's a risk I'm willing to take," she said, her gaze unwavering. "My father died trying to build a bridge between our two peoples. This is my chance to finish it." The council debated for hours. Ayans and his companions, after their initial shock, argued fiercely in her favor. They saw the desperate logic in her plan. It was a long shot, but it was better than sitting in the canyon, waiting for the world to find them and crush them. Finally, a reluctant consensus was reached. The plan was approved, but with a condition. "Yanaba will go with you," Garut decreed. "He will not enter the fort. He will watch from the hills. If you betray us, if you do not return by the 3rd sunset, he has his orders. He will ensure that Sergeant Morrison never speaks again." It was a death sentence, for her and for Morrison, if she failed. The journey to Fort Grant was a stark reversal of her flight from the cabin. This time she was the guide, and Yanaba was the silent shadow behind her. They traveled light and fast. Margaret wore a mix of her old clothes and some borrowed Apache buckskins, a strange hybrid of two worlds. Yanaba was a ghost. She would travel for hours, thinking she was alone, only to see a flicker of movement on a distant ridge, or find a dead rabbit and a freshly laid fire waiting for her when she made camp. He was her guardian angel and her potential executioner. As she drew closer to the fort, the signs of civilization returned. She saw wagon ruts, distant plumes of smoke, the familiar sight of fenced-in land. Each one felt like a betrayal. On the morning of the third day, she stood on a hill overlooking Fort Grant. It was a sprawling, ugly collection of wooden buildings, surrounded by a high stockade, the American flag hanging limp in the windless air. It represented everything her new people feared. She took a deep breath, gave a final look back toward the hills where she knew Yanaba was watching, and began her long walk toward the gates. The guards at the gate were shocked to see a lone white woman, ragged and thin, appearing out of the wilderness. They took her for a survivor of an Apache raid and quickly escorted her inside to the office of the fort's commander. Colonel Whitman was not what she expected. He was an older man, with tired, kind eyes and a deeply lined face that spoke of a long and difficult career. He listened patiently, without interruption, as her story poured out of her. She told him everything. About her father, about Morrison's greed, about the map, the journal, and the Apache band hiding in the mountains. When she finished, he was silent for a long time, studying her face. "Sergeant Morrison is a decorated officer," he said finally, his voice heavy. "And your father. Miss O'Brien, there is a warrant for his arrest for treason." "It's a lie and you know it," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "My father wrote about you in his journal. He said you were an honest man. He said you were the only hope. Please, prove him right." She told him her proposal, the prisoner exchange for a council. Whitman's face was grim. "You are asking me to negotiate with hostiles, to trust the word of a band of renegade Apaches." "And they are being asked to trust you," she countered. "After a lifetime of lies and broken treaties, someone has to take the first step. Someone has to choose peace over war." She had one last card to play. "My father's journal," she said, her voice dropping. "It doesn't just detail Morrison's crimes. It details the corruption of the territorial governor. It names names. It has dates. It has proof of bribes paid for mining rights on Apache land. This is bigger than just one sergeant. And I am the only one who knows where that journal is." That got his attention. The weariness in his eyes was replaced by a sharp, calculating gleam. He knew she was telling the truth. "Set the time and place for the council," he said, his voice firm. "You have my word. Your people will be safe under a flag of truce." 2 days later, in a wide, open meadow halfway between the fort and the mountains, the two groups met. It was a tense, dramatic scene. Colonel Whitman arrived with only a small honor guard. Ayans, Kitchi, and Gerut came with a dozen of their best warriors, their faces painted for war. In the middle of the meadow, Margaret stood with Yanaba, beside a bound and gagged Sergeant Morrison. The exchange was made. Morrison was handed over to the soldiers, and Margaret and Yanaba rejoined their people. Then, the council began. Gerut, as the elder, spoke first. With Kitchi translating, he spoke of the long history of his people, of the broken promises, of the sacredness of the land they were trying to protect. Then, Margaret stepped forward. She opened her father's journal and began to read. She read his accounts of Morrison's threats. She read his descriptions of the governor's conspiracy. She read his pleas for peace and understanding. Finally, she unrolled the map. She laid it on a blanket on the ground, the red and black lines a stark testament to the conflict. Colonel Whitman listened to it all, his face unreadable. When she was done, he knelt and studied the map for a long time. He looked at the journal. Then he stood and faced the Apache elders. "Your friend, Mr. O'Brien, was a brave and honorable man," he said, his voice carrying across the meadow. "And he was right. I have long suspected this corruption, but I lacked the proof. You have brought it to me." He turned to his men. "Sergeant Morrison is under arrest. He will be taken back to the fort and held for a court-martial. A full investigation into the territorial governor's office will begin immediately." A stunned silence fell over the meadow. "And what of our land?" Garut asked, his voice rough with suspicion. "Under the Treaty of 1868, Whitman said, land designated as sacred burial ground cannot be seized for mineral exploration. This map and your testimony will be sent to Washington. I will personally see to it that your claim is honored and your canyon is protected." It was more than they had ever hoped for. It was justice. It was peace. Garut, the stern old man who had seen her as a poison, walked over to Margaret. He looked her in the eye, and for the first time, she did not see hatred. She saw a deep, profound respect. "Your father would be proud of you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You have the heart of an Apache warrior." In the weeks that followed, everything changed. Colonel Whitman was true to his word. The land was protected. Morrison and his co-conspirators were brought to justice, and Margaret found her home. She was no longer a captive, a servant. She was a hero, a respected member of the band. Sister Woman, they called her, the bridge between two worlds. She began her work as a teacher, just as Ions had envisioned. She taught the children and the adults how to read and write, and in turn, they taught her. She learned their language, their legends, their skills. She learned how to track, how to hunt, how to live in harmony with the land that was now her own. Her relationship with Ions grew into a deep and abiding love, born of shared danger and mutual respect. They were two leaders from two different worlds, building a future together. One evening, as she and Ions stood on a ridge overlooking the peaceful canyon, watching the children play below, she thought back to that terrifying night in the cabin. She thought of the fear, the hunger, the loneliness, and she realized that the storm, the one she had thought was her enemy, had actually been her salvation. It had blown her old life away and brought her a new one, a better one, a real one. She had faced an impossible choice, and by choosing mercy over fear, she had found not just survival, but a family, a purpose, and a home. If you were moved by Margaret's incredible journey of courage and transformation, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Her story reminds us that sometimes the greatest treasures are found when we have the courage to open our doors and our hearts to the unexpected. Let us know in the comments what part of her story resonated with you the most.